fertile ground for populism, nativism.
Canadians like to describe their country as a peaceable kingdom, little touched by the effects of war. They also cherish the notion that immigrants to Canada flourish in a tolerant multicultural mosaic rather than struggle against the assimilative melting pot of the United States. The experience of World War I and II challenges both of these myths of Canada's national self-image. During each war, ethnic minorities, Canadians of German, Ukrainian, Italian, or Japanese background, endured nativistic discrimination because of the country of their birth or their ancestral origin, suddenly becoming Canada's enemy. Thousands among them, many naturalized citizens or Canadian-born, lost their legal rights, their property, and their freedom. The beginning of World War I marked the end of the greatest wave of immigration in Canada's history. Between 1900 and 1914, migration from Britain, continental Europe, and the United States increased the population by more than one-third, from just over 5 million to more than 7 million people. Most of these immigrants came to farm the prairies, or to do the rough physical labor needed to open northern Ontario and Canada's best west to economic development. The influx peaked in 1913 when 400,870 migrants arrived in Canada. The reception native-born Canadians gave to these migrants varied according to the newcomers' origins. Immigrants from the British Isles, the United States, Germany, or Scandinavia satisfied prevailing prejudices about which ethnic groups made suitable building blocks for Canadian society. Others from Southern, Eastern, or Central Europe met animosity. Ethnocentric journalists denounced Italians as stiletto-carrying Dagos and Ukrainians as degenerate Eastern Europeans. The number of Asian immigrants was small, but even a minuscule migration from India, China, or Japan aroused virulent nativism. Defined by historians as opposition to an internal minority on the grounds that it posed a threat to Canadian national life, nativism took on many forms, from the routine exploitation meted out to the unskilled Ukrainian labor, to the periodic mob violence which terrorized the Chinese and Japanese of British Columbia. Nativists demanded that the tiny trickle of migrants from Asia be cut off completely, and that the immigration from Europe be strictly regulated to separate the wheat from the chaff. There is a danger, and it is national, warned the introduction to strangers within our gates, a survey of the problem of immigration published in 1909. We must see to it that the civilization and the ideals of southeastern Europe are not transplanted to and perpetuated on our virgin soil. Far from multiculturalism, defined as the preservation and promotion of minority languages and cultures, the goal of English-speaking Canadians was Anglo-conformity, that immigrants to Canada should be forced to assimilate to the language and customs of the majority. A host of proposals ranging from the abolition of bilingual education to the prohibition of alcoholic beverages immigrants used in ethnic celebrations was offered as a means to accomplish this goal. Nativism was well established before World War I, but the guns of August 1914 gave the nativist agenda a new urgency, and specifically identified two ethnic minorities directly with Canadian enemies. Britain's declaration automatically committed Canada to war against the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria. There were few Turks in Canada and fewer Bulgarians. There were more than 500,000 Canadians, 1 in 14, linked by birth or background to Germany and Austria-Hungary. More than 400,000 Canadians were of German descent. Over half of them were Canadian-born and lived in long-established German communities in Nova Scotia and Ontario. These communities took pride in their background and until the war began, they saw no contradiction between their sense of Germanness and their loyalty to Canada. After all, the German and British royal families were related by marriage. As a result of the ease in which the German Canadians accepted their two identities, the burghers of Berlin, Ontario, erected a statue of the Kaiser Wilhelm in the park they named for his grandmother, Queen Victoria. Another 150,000 German-speaking settlers had made their homes in the West since the 1870s. Only a fifth of them came directly from Germany, however. Others arrived from German-speaking areas in Eastern Europe, and still others after a sojourn in the American Middle West. The Germans of the West were also divided by religion. Some were Catholics, some were Lutherans, and like some of the Germans in Ontario, more than 20,000 were Mennonites, members of a pacifistic humanitarian group which had began to establish communities in Manitoba in the late 1870s. This diversity meant that those who shared the German language had no cohesive German ethnic identity, and that few had more than marginal interest in the affairs of Imperial Germany. Until Canadians were blinded by the passions of war, Germans were exempt from the scrutiny of nativists. In Strangers Within Our Gates, J.S. Wordsworth observed that even those who detest foreigners make an exception of Germans, whom they classify as white people like ourselves as a whole. Wordsworth concluded, "It need hardly be said they are amongst our best immigrants." An overwhelming majority of the 120,000 Austrians in Canada in 1914 were in fact Ukrainians from Galicia and Bukovina in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These people were among the 500,000 peasants pushed out of these countries by economic hardship, unable to survive on tiny peasant farms of only 1 or 2 acres. A migration of Ukrainian peasants to Canada had begun in the 1890s, accelerated rapidly after 1905, and continued until cut off by the war. Their destinations were northwestern Ontario or the bushlands of the prairie provinces, where families built self-sufficient homesteads, and men, married and single, toiled as navvies, the contemporary term for unskilled workers in the railway construction and the extractive industries. It was a harsh existence, but after the conditions they had survived in Europe, Canada seemed a promised land to most Ukrainian immigrants. The fulminations of nativists made life that much harder. Usually called Galicians by English Canadians, Ukrainians became a favorite nativist target. In so low an estimation are they held, wrote a journalist more sympathetic than most, that the word Galician is almost a term of reproach. Legally, the only enemy aliens were those who had not yet naturalized, about 20,000 Germans and some 60,000 Ukrainians. But many Anglo-Canadians distrusted naturalized Germans and Austrians, even those who were Canadian-born. Were they loyal to Canada and King George V, or did their hearts secretly belong to Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm and the Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph? For the rest of the World War and beyond, the menace of the enemy alien added a new dimension to the immigration problem. Accidental disasters were attributed to the hidden hand of the enemy alien saboteurs. The fire that destroyed the Parliament building in February 1916, or the explosion that leveled Halifax in December 1917. Harvest time brought rumors that Austrian farmer laborers were about to set fire to the prairie grain crop. One Alberta editor warned that Ukrainians planned to throw off British rule and establish a Ukrainian nation here in Canada. Letters to members of Parliament reported an army of German Americans massing below the United States border, poised to invade, and that Germans or Austrians within Canada were drilling secretly to be ready to join them. nightmares about enemy aliens were groundless. Some recent arrivals from the old country undoubtedly found their loyalties in conflict, but most kept their qualms about the Allied cause to themselves. There was the occasional rash prediction of an Allied defeat. In Pembroke, Ontario, a German bragged that the flag of his fatherland would soon wave over the town's post office. Throughout the war, no German or Ukrainian resident of Canada was ever found guilty of any act of sabotage, and historian Desmond Morton has concluded that it should have been obvious that the Germans and Austrians in Canada pose no significant military threat. Nothing that a German Canadian did seemed enough, however. A Lutheran minister in Pembroke, Ontario, was publicly condemned for addressing his congregation in German, even though his eldest son was in the trenches. A German-born professor in Western Ontario who volunteered to speak at a recruiting rally was rejected on the grounds that he might be a spy. The home front propaganda war imprinted a new negative stereotype of the German to replace the positive pre-war image. The federal government made certain that every newspaper in the country received the British report of the Committee on Allied German Outrages, which accused the German armies in Belgium of murder, lust, and pillage on a scale unparalleled in any war between the civilized nations. Canadian editors responded with a steady stream of atrocity stories which portrayed the enemy as less than human. After a submarine torpedoed the liner Lusitania in May 1915, even the most skeptical Canadians were persuaded that the Germans were subhuman. Sub-crazed madmen with pre-war nativism reshaped and legitimized the war. Enemy aliens faced both popular and official discrimination. Popular discrimination victimized all those with enemy alien connections, whatever their legal status, because it enabled civilians to strike a blow against the enemy. Some was silly. School children refused to sing the songs in their music reader written by German composers, or dog show judges derided dachshunds. But prejudice in the workplace was common and more vicious. The University of Toronto dismissed 3 German-born professors amidst such fanfare. In Infernae, British Columbia, miners struck rather than work alongside Germans. Violence was all too common. In almost every Canadian city, at least once during the war, a frenzied mob smashed and looted the property of real or imagined German Canadians after rumors that an alien had been employed in preference to a veteran. In Regina, the offices of Der Courier, a German-language newspaper, were wrecked. In Berlin, Ontario, 2 German-Canadian clubs were demolished. As repugnant as popular discrimination was, official discrimination from governments had much more serious consequences. The War Measures Act passed without opposition in August 1914. It gave the federal government powers of arrest, detention, exclusion, and deportation of individuals, and specifically denied the rights of bail and of habeas corpus to anyone arrested upon suspicion that he is an alien enemy. These sweeping powers had ominous overtones for ethnic minorities. Although they were used with relative restraint early in the war, by order in council, the War Measures Act eliminated the need for parliamentary approval. Enemy aliens were given 1 month to report with local magistrates acting on behalf of the Dominion Police. 85,000 turned up. Over 80,000 were duly registered, handed over firearms if they owned them, promised not to try and leave Canada, and were allowed to return to their homes. The remainder, considered potentially dangerous, were arrested. In October 1914, an internment system administered by the Department of Justice sprang into being to confine them. Over the next 4 years, a total of 8,579 enemy aliens were imprisoned. The official report of Major General W.D. Otter, the officer who administered the camps, provides an exact accounting of these 7,762 internees who were residents of Canada. The remainder were prisoners of war captured elsewhere. Germans made up only 1,192 of these incarcerated. 5,954 were categorized as Austro-Hungarians. All but a few hundred of these Austrian internees were in fact Ukrainians. Their individual files list many reasons for internment. Fewer than a third were actually enemy reservists. Others were arrested for failing to register, for traveling without permission, for using inappropriate language, for acting in a very suspicious manner, for being shiftless of character, or simply for being undesirable. 6 Ukrainians were interned for lying about their country of birth in order to enlist. The real crime of most Ukrainians was to be out of work. Several city governments used internment as a subterfuge to purge their towns of unemployed immigrant workers. In total, 26 concentration camps were used in which the internees were held and stretched from Halifax to Nanaimo, BC, and ranged from decrepit military installations and abandoned factories to tents in the middle of the bush on the Canadian Shield. As a bitter irony, the largest of the internment camps at Petawawa, Ontario, was built on land expropriated from German immigrant farmers. Some camps held potentially violent German prisoners of war and were really maximum security prisons. At Amherst, Nova Scotia, an attempted escape left 1 prisoner dead, 4 others with bullet wounds, and a guard severely injured. Others were work camps in the wilderness where the principal security measure was the 5-day walk to the nearest town. Despite the barbed wire and middle-aged guards, living and working conditions were not much different than the usual lot of Ukrainian navvies. Internees in such camps resisted passively, leaning on their shovels and exerting themselves as little as they could. One of the few Ukrainian internees to write about his experience in a camp described the work as goofing off most of the time and relaxing in shifts. By 1917, Canada faced a war-induced labor shortage, and it had become obvious that all in positions of authority that virtually all of the Ukrainian internees were no danger to anyone. Over some public protest, all but 3 camps were quietly closed, and all but 2,000 of the inmates were paroled into the custody of railway and resource industry companies. Nonetheless, the significance of the internments for the innocent majority of the prisoners should not be underestimated. The barbed wire was real, and no matter how benign the guards, the rifles were loaded. Internees lost several years of their freedom and were separated from friends and families. Among the camp population, there were few on whom the long years of captivity had not left their mark. One cannot measure the anxiety the threat of internment caused to other Germans or Ukrainians in Canada who never saw the inside of a camp. The Wartime Elections Act of 1917 was the most openly discriminatory blow to minorities during the First World War. Internment and registration applied to only unnaturalized enemy aliens. The Wartime Elections Act deprived unaccounted tens of thousands of naturalized Canadians of a fundamental democratic right to vote. Designed to ensure a victory for the Union government and its policy of conscription, the Act denied the franchise to all those born in enemy country and naturalized subsequent to 31st March 1902. Since naturalization required a minimum of 3 years residence, the Act affected anyone who had arrived in Canada after 1899. The overwhelming majority of Ukrainian Canadians fell into this category. Members of a pacifist religious group, Mennonites and Doukhobors, were similarly stripped of their votes regardless of their place of birth. The contradiction between this colossal gerrymander, or voter manipulation, and Canada's professed war aim of defending democracy was lost on English Anglo-loyalist Canadians, who generally applauded the act. The minorities robbed of their ballots accepted their humiliation with resignation and without public protest, for fear that the government might listen to vocal nativists who complained that the Wartime Elections Act had let the enemy aliens off too lightly. More serious in the long term were the decisions in Manitoba and Saskatchewan to abolish minority language rights in the provincial schools. Anglo-loyalist Canadians saw the public school as their principal weapon in the campaign for British Anglo-conformity, as a mill in which would take in immigrant children and turn them out with the stamp of the crown and the maple leaf. Demands for compulsory unilingual education far predated 1914. But war created the opening nativists needed to achieve their goal. In Manitoba in 1916 and Saskatchewan in 1918, all ethnic minorities, not just Germans and Ukrainians, lost the right to have public schools teach in their mother tongues. To make certain that the children of ethnic minorities learned English, school attendance was made compulsory to the age of 14. Saskatchewan further required school trustees to take an oath of allegiance to the Crown. Harsh as internment and disenfranchisement were, the English Canadian public would have supported even more repressive measures. As the fighting on the Western Front intensified in 1917 and 18, Nativism on the home front intensified along with it. Wounded soldiers returned to Canada to become an outspoken anti-immigrant lobby, angry that the alien had been left to fatten on wartime prosperity. The Great War Veterans Association called for immediate deportation of all enemy aliens and demanded that the naturalized aliens be conscripted to the work industry for the $1.10 a day paid to a private soldier in the trenches. The federal government did not accede to every nativist demand, but as the war dragged on, it began to use its emergency powers with less restraint. The 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia aroused the hopes of radicals and the fears of Canada's ruling class. The federal government had never really believed that the enemy aliens were fifth columns for the Kaiser, but it took much more seriously the thought that enemy aliens might be minions of Lenin and Trotsky. After the Russian Revolution, enemy alien became a synonym for Bolshevik, providing the justification for a new round of political repression. Enemy alien newspapers had been monitored by the Dominion Press censor since 1915. In September 1918, papers which published in German, Ukrainian, and several other enemy alien languages were summarily banned by order in council under the War Measures Act. In October, another such prohibited meetings conducted in the language of any country or portion of any country in which Canada is at war, or in the languages of Russia, Ukraine, or Finland. It further specifically designated 13 left-wing political groups of largely immigrant membership, among them the Ukrainian Social Democrats Party, as unlawful associations. Their supporters could be arrested without warrant and sentenced to up to 5 years imprisonment. Because of its new anti-radical focus, the campaign against enemy aliens did not end with the armistice in November 1918. Instead, it gathered momentum with a post-war Red Scare across North America. The worst of the Nativist riots took place in Winnipeg in January 1919, as veterans marauded through the immigrant north end of the city, demanding that anyone who looked like an alien kneel to kiss the Union Jack. In 1919, the federal government added Section 41 to the Immigration Act to allow the speedy deportation of immigrants who were political radicals. And another order in council of that same year, PC 1203, prohibited Germans, Austrians, Hungarians, Bulgarians, or Turks from entering Canada. The pacifist religious groups of the prairies in British Columbia, the Mennonites and the Russian-speaking Doukhobors, have been left in relative tranquility in their rural communities during the war, although stripped of the ballot and pressured to contribute to wartime charities. Mennonites and Doukhobors were relieved that the federal government honored its promise of exemption from military service. Because of this promise, some 1,200 Hutterian brethren left the United States in 1918 and 19 to establish communal agricultural colonies in Manitoba and Alberta. Their arrival further exacerbated Anglo-English British-Canadian resentment. Another order in council of 1919, PC 1204, specifically denied Doukhobors, Hutterites, and the Mennonites entry into Canada because of their peculiar customs, habits, modes of living, and methods of holding property. The discrimination of wartime affected its two principal minority targets differently. Many German Canadians reacted to the nativism of wartime by shedding the vestiges of their ethnic identity. As K.L. McLaughlin puts it, Schmidt became Smith, Braun became Brown, and Bein became Bean. Anglicized names for German Canadian towns and cities also symbolized this assimilation. Dusseldorf, Alberta, was renamed Freedom. Berlin, Ontario, became Kitchener. Its Board of Education eliminated classes in German in the public schools. Worshippers in its Lutheran churches heard only English language sermons. More than 100,000 German Canadians were sufficiently ashamed or nervous about their background that they identified themselves to the 1921 census takers as Dutch or Austrian. But the injustices meted out to Ukrainian Canadians worked against the nativist goal of assimilation. Their resentment of unilingual education, internment, and disenfranchisement aided a small nationalist intelligentsia to encourage a growing national self-consciousness.